It's Orange and Blue today. We are presented by Champ Honda, Cecil, Lammey, Andrew Mason, continuing our What If series. And what if the Broncos had beaten the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 2005 AFC Championship to go to Super Bowl 40, Mace? That's a big one. Jake Plummer, all those guys would have been remembered a lot differently.
I'll tell you what, I should have worn my Super Bowl 50 ring for this because I was working for the Broncos then. If they win that game, first of all, I think they win the Super Bowl 2 weeks later.
Yes.
I get my Super Bowl ring 10 years earlier.
They would have beaten Seattle.
Yeah, Seattle was not a great team.
Yeah.
Now,
and that was not a great Super Bowl, by the way, at all.
I mean, I know you're Mr. Steelers. You can't argue they got the benefit of some questionable calls.
Yes.
In that game.
Yeah.
It's not a game that was vintage. I'd argue probably of the six Super Bowl winners for the Steelers, the least of them.
Yes. I think Antoine Randall had the prettiest pass in that Super Bowl. So it was not a good game. It was not fun. Seattle fans cried about the refs, which, again, questionable calls.
They had points.
And that postseason, remember, it was the Steelers beating the Colts, and Mike Vanderjagt, that idiot kicker, Peyton Manning's words, not mine, who missed it as he's pointing to Bill Cowher, as he's pointing to the Steelers. He misses the kick. We all remember the Jerome Bettis fumble, and then Ben Roethlisberger had to work around and get that tackle. But it was the Steelers taking out the Colts that caused the AFC Championship game to be hosted in Denver. And for whatever reason, and I've talked to plenty of players, whether it was Nick or whoever, that said, man, Broncos country, y'all sold out. Like you sold their tickets. It seemed like, and you and I were both at that game, it seemed like 40% Steelers fans.
It wasn't that many.
But it seemed that way.
It seemed that way by the end because the Steelers were playing well. I recall yellow towels amidst the orange towels, but they weren't an overwhelming amount. What happened was the Broncos played poorly and Steelers fans took over the place in a way that might not have happened otherwise. But the other thing is this. First of all, Pittsburgh making it there, kind of a miracle. You mentioned the Vanderjagt, reliable kicker that year, missing. The week before, if Kimo von Oelhoffen doesn't tear Carson Palmer's ACL,
right,
I do not think Pittsburgh beats Cincinnati in Cincinnati.
Yeah, Cincinnati was damn good.
That changed Carson Palmer's career as well. That changed a lot of things.
Yep.
Did that injury because he wasn't really back to that level for nearly 8 years. 2 teams later, because he ends up going to the Raiders and the Cardinals.
Right.
So there's that angle to it. But the thing is, I'll never forget after Vanderjagt missed and the Steelers win, thus ensuring the AFC Championship game is going to be right here in Denver. I texted a buddy of mine and I said, be careful what you wish for. You might get it. Because Pittsburgh was on a winning streak at that point. They just looked, I had a bad feeling. And I feel like in this town that week leading up to the AFC Championship game, because the Colts, the great white whale for the Broncos at that point was the Colts and Peyton Manning. Lost to them in the 2003 playoffs, lost to them in the 2004 playoffs, and not just lost, got obliterated both times.
Decimated.
Yes. Just got your butts kicked up and down that field. If the Broncos go to Indianapolis, nobody thinks they're going to win that game, right? Right. And then you can kind of go in loose and fancy free. Hey, nobody believes in us, right? That's a great motivator, thinking like nobody believes in you. Well, that week, AFC Championship game in Denver, it seemed like the whole world believed in the Broncos that they were going to win that game. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the Broncos kind of let up because they've gotten out from playing their nemesis.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Steelers were a wild card team that year.
Yes.
So they had the underdog play, and then the miracle Ben Roethlisberger tackle after the Bettis fumble, Vanderjagt pointing at Cowher and then missing the kick. So you had this air of destiny.
Correct me if I'm wrong, they were the number 6 seed.
I believe so.
They were the bottom seed in the AFC.
Yes.
And because didn't Jacksonville go like 12-4 that year or something like that? They were really good. And they played New England and lost to the Patriots in the other wild card game. So, all right. So let's say
we've only just begun in this episode, by the way.
Yeah, we have. So let's say the Broncos don't, in the parlance of John Fox, pick a bad day to have a bad day.
Love Foxy.
Let's start with the potential interception that goes through Champ Bailey's hands early on. Say he gets it.
Yeah.
Okay. Broncos get some momentum. They use their running game, which was a great running game that year with Tatum Bell and Mike Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
Control the pace. Jake Plummer continues being no mistake Jake. Broncos get behind. He starts having to throw. It exacerbates it. All of a sudden it's the snowball becoming the avalanche going downhill. That interception he had right before the end of the first half, leading to a Steelers touchdown that made it 24-3.
Yep.
So in this universe, you have Jake Plummer still playing within himself, doing what Gary Kubiak is telling him to do.
Yes. You have Tatum Bell not getting the shoestring tackle that
the
former players always talk about. Like, Tatum, just break that tackle.
Right. Broncos pull away and win, say, 27-17. Okay. As we've said, 2 weeks later, they win the Super Bowl. So Mike Shanahan has his third world championship. Jake Plummer is a world champion quarterback.
Yep. And guess what next year they did?
John Lynch gets a ring in Denver to go on with his ring in Tampa.
Yes.
Champ Bailey gets his Super Bowl ring. Among the many things that have changed are Hall of Fame discussions. Okay. Because to rattle a few off. Now, Champ Bailey is still a first ballot Hall of Famer because he was first ballot regardless. John Lynch, first ballot Hall of Famer.
Yes.
Mike Shanahan, first opportunity, Hall of Famer.
Right in.
I think Rod Smith even ends up having a better argument than existed before.
Ugh.
Rod can't get any traction, unfortunately. But if he's a wide receiver with those numbers and 3 rings, one without John Elway, I think Rod is at least making the finalists year after year.
Yes.
He's in the conversation, whereas right now,
nobody talks about it.
Nobody talks about it because, and unfortunately for him, there are a lot of really productive receivers. I mean, of that era, you just go down the list, and Rod's, kind of somewhere tucked behind Jimmy Smith and Steve Smith,
right?
Torrey Holt.
When the league became more pass happy at that time, that's when it was first starting to happen. I believe Jake Plummer, until Peyton Manning got here, was the record holder for most touchdown passes in a season for the Broncos, and I believe it was 25.
Back in the 04 season.
Yeah, the 04 season.
When he also had a lot of interceptions, which is what led to the change.
No mistake, Jake.
No mistake, Jake.
But what happened in the 2006 NFL draft?
Broncos trade up and pick Jay Cutler.
And they don't do that if they win Super Bowl 40.
They don't.
That was a damn good team with Jake.
It was. But here's the thing. First of all, I think this is a one-off champion. I don't think they get back to a Super Bowl in this era. And one of the reasons why is Gary Kubiak walks out the door. I think he still leaves. He was clearly the guy of the late Bob McNair, Houston Texans owner. And of course, we know that Kubiak is a Houston guy himself. The day after the Super Bowl, or maybe 2 days later, he still takes that Texans job. And so thus, I think you still have the late Mike Heimerdinger coming in and being the OC for the Broncos. And Dinger and Jake did not mesh as well as Coobs did. Coobs was perfect as a complement to Mike Shanahan for Jake Plummer because it was very much kind of good cop, bad cop. And, Coobs could be hard on guys, but he was also, he could also kind of take it down a bit. Coobs was so good at polishing out Mike's rough edges. And that's part of why Mike never did as well without Coobs as he did with him. The only time he went to the playoffs without Gary Kubiak as a head coach was the year that he and Kyle Shanahan redesigned the offense in Washington for RG3 and everything clicked. Okay. So I'm going to live in the universe here where Jake Plummer, in spite of the success in Super Bowl 40 and winning it all, still starts to decline in 06 for the Broncos. But you don't have Jay Cutler there looming behind
pushing him out the door.
And he's got a Super Bowl ring, so he's got some success equity built up. That means you're more patient with some struggles. You kind of get you give a little bit more leeway than you end up giving. So first of all, without Jay Cutler there, Jake Plummer plays the entire 06 season.
The first Thursday night game in the NFL Network, they were what, 7 wins at the time when the news comes out from Adam Schefter that they're going to make a change at quarterback.
They were 7-3 because they lost that one, and they lost to Seattle, and they lost to the Chargers. That put them at 7-6. They were 7-3. They just lost to San Diego 4 days earlier on Sunday Night Football, and I mean that was the infamous sight from that game. Is Larry Coyer, late Larry Coyer. For whatever reason, Larry had Ebenezer Ekubon in coverage on LaDainian Tomlinson coming out of the backfield. And so the defining sight for me from that game is LaDainian Tomlinson ahead of a trailing Ekubon. Like, what are we doing here? Like, what is that matchup? But it's still a team that I think goes to the playoffs. Maybe they still go on a losing streak there late in that season. But I think they put it back together, and I think they end up eking out one more win than they would have made.
When you don't lose half the locker room.
Yeah. I think maybe either they beat Seattle at home or they beat the 49ers at home, maybe even both. But I think with the Broncos, you're talking about a 10 or 11 win team that ends up a very strong second place to the 14-2 Chargers in the AFC West that year, rather than the 9-win team that misses the playoffs. I have to say this because it's something that if you're listening, you may be thinking, and because the what if that kind of haunts me. Because all the what ifs about that 06 season include what if the Broncos had made the playoffs and the guys hadn't been out as late as they were. Maybe Darren Williams is still with us. That's something that I think anyone who's around that team back then, as you and I were covering the team, I think that haunts me when I think about it. That even in the regular scenario, if they could have just worked out a tie rather than losing the 49ers at the end. But anyway, so that's an elephant in the room that we had to mention.
For sure.
Okay. Getting past that, they get to the playoffs. Maybe they're one and done. Maybe they have to go to New England or Indiana. They'd go to New England or Indianapolis. They'd probably lose in the wild card round, but okay. You're still a playoff team with 10 or 11 wins.
After winning Super Bowl.
After winning the Super Bowl. So, okay. First of all, how long does Jake Plummer last as quarterback?
You could still play mistake-free Jake football.
But you wouldn't have had Coobs in there.
Right. So a couple more years.
I think by 08, 09, you're looking for a quarterback.
Yes.
Like, by 08, you're at, let's say, maybe by 07, Mike Shanahan is starting to look at the quarterbacks.
Maybe even plucking some late-round guys. Trying to get his Gus Frerotte type thing. Like, okay, who's that other guy that I can get? Who is the Kirk Cousins? Who is that guy? Mike Shanahan would have been looking.
He would have been looking.
Even after winning Super Bowl 40, which, a smart coach going to set yourself up in case of emergency, break glass, but in case you couldn't make it work with Jake Plummer, who would be some of the quarterback options?
Well, here's where let's get to 08, okay? I'm going to throw these are the names of the quarterbacks drafted in 08. Matt Ryan, number 2 overall. So, no, you're not getting him. Because we're going to assume I'm going to assume in 07 a frustrating type of year.
I know one you're going to say.
Joe Flacco, number 18 overall pick. I don't know that he's Mike's kind of quarterback, though.
I would hope not.
He's a little bit stiff.
Okay. Who's a Mike-type quarterback from that draft class, then? Matt Ryan, you're not going to get, although that would have been perfect. You saw what Matt Ryan did with Kyle Shanahan when Matt accepted that.
Okay. They picked 2 quarterbacks, one mid-round, one late round.
Okay.
In 08. Kevin O'Connell is the mid-round quarterback they pick in the 3rd round out of San Diego State.
Okay.
Josh Johnson is the late-round quarterback they pick out of the University of San Diego. So a couple of City of San Diego quarterbacks. Josh Johnson ends up being a long-term backup. So this alternate universe, Josh Johnson becomes the Gary Kubiak of his generation.
Coming from a Jim Harbaugh offense for the Toreros at San Diego.
Right. Josh Johnson ends up being the long-term backup. Kevin O'Connell looks like he could be a terrific coach. Did not have it as a quarterback. I don't think Mike would have been enough. And so at some point, you're starting to maybe even cycle through free agents.
But before we jump on from Josh, not because I'm his buddy and have supported him since day one, look at what Brock Purdy's done with Kyle Shanahan. Can you imagine a scenario where Josh Johnson, again, in that offense, which makes the quarterback, you get the most out of the quarterback you possibly can. There's no way Josh Johnson could have been a Brock Purdy type of player for Mike?
Maybe, but I don't think it would have lasted.
Okay.
I think it would have been just enough to keep the Broncos from diving into the quarterback pool in like 09, 2010. I think the ceiling would have been limited. The other thing that's happening is that this defense, if Mike is continuing to go through defensive coordinators year after year, or after the 08 season, one of the things that made things go sideways after the 8-8 season. And by the way, at that point, you're just a couple of years removed from the Super Bowl. You're not firing Mike Shanahan.
No.
Pat Bowlen is not firing Mike Shanahan because they win Super Bowl 40. Okay. So you're going on with Mike Shanahan as coach. But I think at this point, you have come back to the pack. You are sitting there in that 7-9, 9-7 type of range. And especially if you've got Josh Johnson, what I think he does is he keeps you out of the 09 draft pool, which was terrible, right? But now you get to 2010 here, and now we're back at a point where we start seeing a bunch of quarterbacks going off the board. Like you've gotten Josh Johnson for a couple of years. You've seen he's capable.
It was okay.
He's okay, but not great. So now we get to 2010, and this is the Sam Bradford, Tim Tebow, Jimmy Clausen, Colt McCoy year. Colt McCoy is another guy who translated to the West Coast.
Yeah.
So in 2010, the Broncos use a day 2 pick on Colt McCoy. Now here's where I think the outcome would have been a lot different. With all respect to Josh Johnson, I think his skill set is back up. And I think he would have settled as that. Colt McCoy, Broncos 2010, meshes with Mike Shanahan. And probably Kyle Shanahan by this point is coming back to rejoin Mike on the staff.
And you're grooming your next head coach in waiting, everybody.
Right. Colt McCoy's outcome, and I believe also, if I'm not mistaken, Mike Holmgren was a fan of Colt McCoy coming out. So he was held in high regard by some of the West Coast practitioners who are very, very closely connected. Colt McCoy does enough to be a solid mid-level quarterback surrounded by talent. Like, for example, Brandon Marshall, the wide receiver, doesn't go sideways. He stays here. He ends up having a brilliant career. This is another thing. Brandon Marshall, the wide receiver, ends up holding every Broncos receiving record for a wide receiver.
So if we're talking Hall of Fame conversations,
yes,
Brandon Marshall.
Wide receiver Brandon Marshall. He puts up huge numbers in Denver, no matter who the quarterback is. He's got his guy, Mike Shanahan, defending
15
him.
is never worn by Tim Tebow. Think of what we're changing
Tim Tebow's never here.
Tebow's never drafted.
Right. Because Mike Shanahan wouldn't have drafted Tim Tebow. He would have found Colt McCoy a heck of a lot more attractive.
He might have drafted Tebow as a running back.
Yes.
Full disclosure.
But the thing is, eventually, as would often happen, Mike and Kyle would have reached the point where they're like, okay, have we gone as far as we can with a Colt McCoy? Because here's the thing. I don't think we're talking about the Broncos winning a Super Bowl in this stretch.
Right.
I think we're talking about their bottoming out point being a cluster of 7-9 and 9-7 years. But I think now as we get into the 2010s, they're back to winning 10 or 11 games a year. I think they've fixed the defensive issues by a certain point. Eventually Mike would have found somebody that meshed with him to run a defense. And I think they would have eventually figured things out on that side.
Would they have eventually drafted Kirk Cousins then?
That's where I'm going with this.
Okay.
Colt McCoy is pretty good, but Mike keeps always looking. Kirk Cousins is taken late in the third round of the 2012 NFL draft by the Denver Broncos. And he's clearly at another level than the quarterbacks that you've had for this post Jake Plummer interregnum.
You went through Josh Johnson and Colt McCoy for a couple of years.
Right. And you were okay. I'm going to say there's a playoff appearance in there. Maybe, you know what? Maybe you still steal the division, but you steal it at 9-7 in 2011 instead of 8-8 with Tim Tebow, right? Kirk Cousins by 2013 emerges as the Broncos quarterback, but he's got Mike Shanahan and then Kyle Shanahan with him. Kirk Cousins at some point leads the Denver Broncos to a Super Bowl.
Yes.
So the conversation about Kirk Cousins is different. You're not looking at him as this playoff loser, a guy who gets in and falls short. Eventually, with Mike and then Kyle whispering in his ear. Although, is it ever Kyle? What if they keep winning and so they're successful? Does Mike hand it off to Kyle? Or does Mike keep on going and Kyle realizes he's going to have to go somewhere else to spread his wings?
I think he would hand it off to him and then take a consulting role. But because we're talking about Cousins
team president.
Yes.
John Elway never, because this is another thing.
Yeah.
John Elway never comes back to the Broncos in that role. He's never the GM. He's never the president of football operations.
Mike Shanahan is.
Mike Shanahan takes on that role.
Here's something that's going to make Broncos fans a little bit sad. You don't have Peyton Manning.
Yeah, you don't. Peyton Manning goes to
Houston. Gary didn't want him, though. Gary, why would you not want Peyton Manning in Houston? I always said San Francisco. I was on 9 News the day before the decision for Peyton Manning.
Harbs and Peyton would have choked each other.
And I said, point. 49ers. Peyton Manning's going to the 49ers. Next day, it chose the Broncos. So
yeah.
Whatever. I'm glad. I'm happy.
Jim Harbaugh and Peyton Manning would not have coexisted well. That's, I mean, 2 alphas, right? That would have been tough. He wasn't going to go to Seattle because he was ticked off at how Seattle kind of was going about it.
Tennessee?
The problem with Tennessee is they were in the same division as the Colts. See, at this point now, you're in an uncomfortable spot. He didn't want to be in the same division as his former team, the Colts. He also didn't really want to be in the NFC because he didn't want to potentially have to go up against his brother, Eli in the postseason. I think of those two, what would have won would have been dealing with the Colts being in the same division and Peyton Manning is a Tennessee Titan.
Yeah, because he was released. They didn't hold him for a year and trade him. Make Andrew Luck wait.
So what happens then? Well, Titans become interesting. And then at some point there's a Titans Broncos playoff game.
Yes.
Who's the Titans head coach? Well, it was Mike Munchak at the time. It works out. Munch ends up continuing to be a head coach. Never goes to Pittsburgh. Sorry, Cease. Never comes to Denver.
Sorry, Mace.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, sorry me. I like Munch.
But with Kirk Cousins, they would have won another Super Bowl.
Yes. And he'd still be the quarterback today.
Yep. And you'd have probably Kyle Shanahan and Kirk Cousins.
Yes. Kyle Shanahan would be the coach today. So think about this now.
Wow.
In this alternate universe, and Mike Shanahan's already in the Hall of Fame. He's put on the gold jacket, all that.
Right.
But in this alternate universe, we are heading into the 29th consecutive season in which the Broncos were coached by a Shanahan. Talk about a dynasty.
Beautiful.
And we're saying 1 Super Bowl with Cousins. We're saying Mike would have won it with Jake Plummer. So we're saying 4 Super Bowls for the Broncos rather than 3. And because things are running reasonably well, the team is still sold because I don't think you've changed any of the family dynamics. That's another thing. The family dynamics in the Bowlen clan were such to where I think in all this, the team is still sold.
Even with the winning ways,
you're not. Yeah,
it's still
I mean,
but if you're Walton Penner Group now, you're like, yeah, give me a piece of that. I don't have to change a thing.
They're inheriting it, and it's just
keep it going.
Just keep it going. It's Mike, Kyle, what do you need? Mike is still here as the president of football operations, and Kyle is your head coach. That incubator of coaches, instead of being that Washington staff in the early to mid 2010s, it becomes Denver. So we're looking at the Broncos and seeing how names, like Matt LaFleur and
Sean
McVay have come through this staff rather than that Washington staff. This is the epicenter of the QB collective, as it were.
Wow.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
All from just winning.
One game.
One
game. The AFC Championship in 2005 changed everything that day. I was so sad after that, man. Super Bowl, man. It was, God, I really felt like I felt that moment like they had blown their best chance. And
because they did.
For a generation, it turned out it was. And, that's why Mike's still waiting to go into the Hall of Fame.
Get him there.
It's coming soon. It's coming soon.
It will. It has to.
Yeah.
It has to. You can't write the history of the NFL without a Mike Shanahan. It's incredible.
And his case gets stronger every day. That's the beautiful thing about it.
Yeah.
Every one of his disciples that continues doing well is another feather in his cap. What Mike Shanahan did as a coach has never been more relevant than it is today. Mm-hmm. It's why I even said, hey, maybe, because you convinced Mike Shanahan to be the head coach right now. I would have been fine with that.
I would have been fine with that as well. We'll see.
Still got it.
Love it. The What If series on Orange and Blue today. We are presented by Sean Ponda. He's Mace. I'm Cecil. Everyone, thanks for watching. Do those YouTube things. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Hit the notification bell so that you never miss a vid. Hit the freaking like button. I like quoting Den of Nerds. We're our own Den of Nerds. Just for football.
Yes, that's
He's
true.
Mace. I'm Cecil.